Mr. Frederick Douglass notes that one of the most humiliating and saddening scenes that he ever witnessed as a slave was the whipping of an old man on Colonel Lloyd's plantation by Colonel Lloyd himself. This was another demonstration of the debasing nature of American slavery, which Mr. Douglass had the unfortunate opportunity to see when he was just a little boy. Now, in his 1855 autobiography titled My Bondage and My Freedom, he describes this situation taking place in the horses' stable, where
my fondness for horses, not peculiar to me more than to other boys, attracted me, much of the time, to the stables. This establishment was especially under the care of Old and young Barney, father and son. Old Barney was a fine-looking old man of a brownish complexion who was quite portly and wore a dignified aspect for a slave.
So Old Barney was of a brownish complexion, just like all the other slaves were of a brownish complexion. But he was also handsome, and he carried himself with dignity, which was remarkable for a slave.
He was evidently much devoted to his profession, and held his office an honorable one. He was a farrier as well as an ostler. He could bleed, remove lampers from the mouths of the horses, and was well instructed in horse medicines. No one on the farm knew, so well as Old Barney, what to do with a sick horse, but his gifts and acquirements were of little advantage to him. His office was by no means an enviable one.
Other slaves didn't wish they had that job, and the reason for this is
he often got presents, but he got stripes as well. For in nothing was Colonel Lloyd more unreasonable and exacting than in respect to the management of his pleasure horses.
They would have had to deal with Colonel Lloyd, who Mr. Douglass describes as unreasonable when it came to dealing with those horses. And I suspect that all the other slaves must have known this as well, which is why this job was by no means enviable. Now, just how unreasonable was Colonel Lloyd?
Any supposed inattention to these animals were sure to be visited with degrading punishment. His horses and dogs fared better than his men. Their beds must be softer and cleaner than those of his human cattle. No excuse could shield Old Barney if the colonel only suspected something wrong about his horses, and consequently, he was often punished when faultless.
That's how unreasonable the colonel was. His animals had to be taken care of better than the humans. And if he even suspected for 1 second that something was wrong with those horses, then Old Barney was punished. Mr. Douglass writes,
"It was absolutely painful to listen to the many unreasonable and fretful scoldings poured out at the stable by Colonel Lloyd, his sons and sons-in-law. Of the latter, he had 3, Messrs. Nicholson, Winder, and Loans. These all lived at the great house a portion of the year, and enjoyed the luxury of whipping the servants when they pleased, which was by no means unfrequently."
The great house was Colonel Lloyd's big house on one of his many plantations. The sons, the son-in-laws, they all stayed here, and they enjoyed the luxury of whipping slaves whenever they felt like it. Now, recall in Commentary 242 where Mr. Douglass says that everyone in the South wants the privilege to whip someone. This here is what he's talking about. And the sons, they use their whipping privileges for petty situations such as these.
A horse was seldom brought out of the stable to which no objection could be raised. There was dust in his hair. There was a twist in his reins. His mane did not lie straight. He had not been properly grained. His head did not look well. His foretop was not combed out. His fetlocks had not been properly trimmed. Something was always wrong.
You see how petty and ridiculous that sounds? A dust was in his hair. Oh, snaps, this stuff is wild. Old Barney must have certainly known that it was wild and foolish too. But they had him scared doing this.
Listening to complaints, however groundless, Barney must stand, hat in hand, lips sealed, never answering a word. He must make no reply, no explanation. The judgment of the master must be deemed infallible, for his power is absolute and irresponsible.
Here we go.
One of the most heart-saddening and humiliating scenes I ever witnessed was the whipping of Old Barney by Colonel Lloyd himself. Here were 2 men, both advanced in years. There were the silvery locks of Colonel L., and there was the bald and toil-worn brow of Old Barney, master and slave, superior and inferior here, but equals at the bar of God, and, in the common course of events, they must both soon meet in another world. In a world where all distinctions except those based on obedience and disobedience are blotted out forever.
The whipping went like this.
"Uncover your head,"
said the imperious master. He was obeyed.
"Take off your jacket, you old rascal."
And off came Barney's jacket.
"Down on your knees."
Down knelt the old man, his shoulders bare, his bald head glistening in the sun, and his aged knees on the cold, damp ground. In his humble and debasing attitude, the master, that master to whom he had given the best years and the best strength of his life, came forward and laid on 30 lashes with his horsewhip. The old man bore it patiently to the last, answering each blow with a slight shrug of the shoulders and a groan. I cannot think that Colonel Lloyd succeeded in marring the flesh of Old Barney very seriously, for the whip was a light riding whip, but the spectacle of an aged man, a husband and a father, humbly kneeling before a worm of the dust, surprised and shocked me at the time, and since I have grown old enough to think on the wickedness of slavery, few facts have been of more value to me than this, to which I was a witness. It reveals slavery in its true color and in its maturity of repulsive hatefulness.
Events like this accumulated in his mind and led him to hate and despise the system of slavery. It was these demoralizing situations that planted the yet tiny seeds of escape and freedom in his mind. But both escape and freedom would have been much more difficult for Mr. Douglass if he had not developed one very important skill. And that skill was reading, which we'll discuss in the next commentary. So definitely stay tuned for that as we continue climbing the consciousness out of the pit and decolonizing the mind, right? So right now, what I want to do is thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.